Welcome to By the Well with me, Fran Barber.
And me, Robin Whittaker.
We're recording this from home on Zoom again during stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne. So again, we apologise in advance if the sound quality is not up to our usual standard.
The readings for today are Exodus 12, 1-14, the Passover story, and Matthew 18, 15-20. We aren't going to read those readings, so if you're not familiar with them, this would be a good time to pause and just have a look at the Bible readings for this week.
And this week we're really grateful to have Bill Loader with us again. Bill's been on By the Well before. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
The Reverend Bill Loader is Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Murdoch University. He's written numerous books, but has one coming out shortly, and we'll be sure to put our link in later when it comes out. This book's called What Can Love Hope For? We'll also put in our show notes the link to Bill's Lectionary resources page, which is a great resource for preachers. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
So let's start with Matthew 18. Bill, give us some context here. Where are we? We've jumped a couple of chapters in the lectionary. What do we need to know about where we are in the text at this point?
Okay, we are in a section which is talking about, really giving instructions for the community and what it means to be a follower of Jesus in community. So this particular chapter begins with warnings against child abuse, or at least abuse of the little ones, which may be a term just for fellow believers. It then goes on to make some very stern comments about pulling out your eye and cutting off your limbs, which had been used earlier in a sexual context, and it may still have those connotations here. So we may even be dealing with sexual abuse here. Of course, that happened in the ancient world, happens in our own world as well, and of course it needs to be dealt with. And then, of course, you go on in Matthew 18, you have that wonderful story of the 99 sheep and the one that went astray, but Matthew's tweaked that so that it's actually about fellow believers in the community of faith who go astray and don't leave them out in the cold, reach out to them. And then, of course, we have our passage. Can talk about that,
yeah, which might have a different message.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the contradiction here, Bill, when, as you say, we have the reading following about the lost sheep following. But we also have the passage about forgiving one's neighbours 70 times 7 times. And then we have this passage saying, well, actually, there are limits and you turf them out.
Okay, well, actually, it's quite interesting. 15 to 18 in particular deals with conflict and conflict management. And it is surrounded, I think deliberately, this is a work of the editor, the author of the first gospel. And it's probably a he, puts the 99 sheep story in front of it and puts the forgiveness 70 times 7 after it. So there's a kind of compassion message there. But what we have in that particular section is a very early form of conflict management. And it also deals with issues of discipline. And, we'll want to talk about that. I think Matthew is really interested, I'm using Matthew for the author of Matthew, is really interested in conflict and how people get on with each other. So in the Sermon on the Mount, it's a major theme, don't kill, so don't harbor anger against people. And then additional things are added in. So you go up to Jerusalem, you're about to offer your sacrifice, you realize you've got a relationship problem, go back to Galilee. Like, it's almost funny. It's quite extreme. And picks up the bit about if you're going to court, try to settle it before you go to court. Otherwise you'll be in trouble. And then the parable of the wheat and the tares is probably the same thing. Don't go pulling out the weeds out of your congregation. All of these things. So it's really at one level a wonderful passage which says to people, look, if you've got a problem with somebody, don't gossip. But this is highly relevant for churches and communities. Don't go and talk to the person. Go and sit down with them and say, look, when you do this, this is my response to that. It's actually hurting. We need to talk it through. And if they won't listen to you, go with somebody else. You can see biblical law being reflected in this out of Deuteronomy, that in a court you really need to have 2 witnesses or more for things to stand up. That kind of looks like a personal conflict kind of situation, and it's expressed like that in 1815. And then it says, now, if there really is a big problem, bring it to the ecclesia, bring it to the church, bring it to the congregation. And then you have the statement, well, the congregation then needs to decide whether this person should belong or should not belong. And of course, this is where excommunication comes in. And it's quite striking that Matthew goes on to say, well, you as a congregation have got the power to bind and loose. That means you've got the power to interpret the law and apply it in a forensic sense. You've got the power that earlier on we were told was given to Peter, the key to the kingdom. So here you've got it given to the local congregation, which somewhat undermines the theory of papal infallibility.
Yes.
Peter, of course. Now it's the infallibility. An extraordinary thing is a claim is being made by the author of Matthew's Gospel that their congregations have got this kind of authority and that heaven will support it.
But interesting, can I interject here, Bill? Because when we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, when Peter is given that privilege and power, the first thing he does is overreach and completely misunderstand the church's Lord. So what I find interesting here is a sort of idealistic straightforwardness about this judgment stuff, that actually the faithful good thing will be done if we come together as the church and, where 2 or 3 of us are gathered, Jesus will be there. Well, really? It's not always that simple. And we'll, given our track record, will we make the right decision?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to have that pointed out, because Peter, not only gets the understanding of his confession wrong, Jesus the Christ is not meant to suffer, he's meant to be a winner. That's what males do when lords. And then, of course, he denies Jesus. So, the fallibility of Peter is underlined twice in Matthew's Gospel. The fallibility of the congregation is also implied. So you have a kind of a tension here, both in the Peter story and in the church story of dealing with conflict. It says where 2 or 3 are gathered together, I'm there in their midst. Now, I've used that. We have used that down through the centuries. Well, I haven't been down through the centuries, but, we've used it to say, this is really saying when we gather for worship, Jesus is present. No, it's not actually. It's saying when you have got a discipline committee, and you're needing to make really tough decisions because there's been abuse, then I'm there with you, helping you. Shekinah, the presence of God in rabbinic literature, is promised when rabbis get together and try to interpret the law. So, yes, there's a big claim being made here on Matthew's part. I think it's actually a very dangerous claim, but it's also saying, look, you've got to take decisions like this, and I'm going to be with you when you have to work it through.
Yep. For me, but I think too that presence, that's really interesting about the rabbinic context. But here the presence is Jesus who was crucified. So there's something about the identity of the cross and the cross coming in here which offers us both judgment and mercy around the decisions we make. That is, the cross shows that we make the wrong decision in worldly terms. So I'll just leave that there as a theological point that I think is really important, or a conundrum to consider.
Yeah, when we think canonically and we put it all together, we can do that. I think in Matthew's narrative, it's not actually referring to the cross. It's simply the presence of Jesus. It's the one who says at the end, I will be with you always to the end of the age. The promise of Christ's presence when we act when we have to act with authority and need to acknowledge our fallibility. And it's always important for the church to know that. And that's why I think Matthew's sensitivity to that is not so much by modifying it, but by surrounding it with the 99 sheep. You go and care for the person who's gone astray. And the 70 times 7, you learn about forgiveness.
Yeah.
We don't write people off. And of course, it's been important for us. You know, we've had people who we've really needed to say, you know, this is not on. We needed sometimes to report things to the police. You know, what we don't do is we say, now these people, these priests, these ministers, or these other people who have been engaged in abusive situations, they don't cease to be human. They don't cease to be loved by God. Love, of course, means telling the truth, which is confronting. But we don't write people off. The popular thing, of course, is to write criminals off and, you know, lock them up and throw away the key. Of course, that's partly inspired by Matthew too, because there's this notion that really the people who don't accept us will be tortured forever. Now, these are horrific thoughts. So,
yeah, harsh judgment there.
We're looking at light and shade.
Yeah.
The Gospels, we are bearers of the tradition, and the tradition is really destructive and really creative. And in ministry, the key is to know the difference.
I think that's really helpful, that, again, that the context of Matthew and the wider lens of compassion, because we've seen the fault of the church when it's either judged too harshly, or in recent royal commissions when the church has failed to act and report and deal with abuse in its midst. Both are detrimental, probably the latter far more detrimental to the vulnerable, but we failed on both counts. Bill, I want to unpack a little bit both the beginning and the kind of end of this conflict process, because the way I've seen this manifest, particularly in some conservative churches I was part of, is this kind of dealing with a problematic member can often end up being about doctrine, and yet it starts with a member sinning against you. So I'm wondering how we read that initial context there. And I'm also interested in this, you know, putting someone outside the community. The language Matthew uses is they're treated like an ethnikos, a Gentile maybe, and a tax collector. So can we unpack those words, and what's the resonance there for a early Christian?
Yes, I think we are dealing with a set of rules, community rules, which are similar to what you find in other, like at Qumran, in the sect of the Dead Sea. But I think, you know, let's not get into saying it's Jewish. You know, it's not Christian. Of course it's Christian. It's been developed in probably a conservative Jewish Christian context, and Matthew inherits some of those traditions. You see it also reflected on the Sermon on the Mount. You know, don't be like the Gentiles who phrases, you know. This treating them as tax collectors and sinners, or Gentiles, that really is meant originally to say have nothing to do with them. And of course,
so it's a harsh word. It's not.
They're called dogs elsewhere, of course.
It's an exclusive comment. Yes. So again, we've got light and shade. And of course, really, when you read the whole of Matthew's gospel, and of course, if you read canonically, but read the whole of the story of Jesus, treat me like a tax collector. That means you're going to love me. That means you're going to come and sit with me, you know. Actually, what Matthew does by putting the 99 sheep at the front and the 77 times forgiveness at the end is actually, in effect, saying you treat them as somebody who's to be loved. So,
as a sinner to be brought back into the fold, ultimately.
A Gentile. Yeah. Coming back to your first question, no, I don't think this is about doctrine. As you say, you know, it's somebody sins against you. So it's actually about feeling wronged. So it's not, you know, feeling wronged in doctrine. It's probably feeling wronged in some other way. But, you know, it gets applied in these ways, of course.
Yeah. We need to move on to Exodus in a minute or two. But any themes emerge, or anything else you want to explore or worth pointing out in this reading for those who might preach on the gospel this week?
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to take this passage, acknowledge that it's a very primitive first century schedule for how to deal with conflict, and so it's got its limitations. It's couched in the gospel, both in terms of a literary work and also in terms of our theology, but also to pick it up in preaching and talk about how you handle conflict. And how you handle, it's okay to have anger and hurt. It's what you do with it. So go and deal with these things one-to-one. These are still crucial things for healthy communities, healthy congregations, and they're frequently neglected. It frequently happens that people, I'll go and talk with you about somebody else. That's just a common human tendency. And here we've got teaching which says, don't gossip, don't do that. Don't, triangulate like that. Go and talk to the person. It's a very healthy thing. It's a wonderful opportunity to address healthy conflicts.
And healthy relationships in general.
Yeah, and I would emphasise the whole binding and loosing there, sort of the gravity. I mean, there's a lot of gravitas in what it is the church is asked to do.
Yep.
And therefore risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly something that we've learned over the last couple of decades, that the church has also got to look very carefully at where it has been abusive, consciously or unconsciously, and where clergy have got away with things that have really been unhelpful and unhealthy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
You're listening to By the Well with special guest, the Reverend Professor Bill Loader. By the Well is produced by Pilgrim Theological College, the Uniting Church in Victorian Tasmania, and the technical help of Adrian Jackson. We're going to move on now to discussing Exodus 12 and the Passover story. Here in Exodus 12, again, the lectionary has skipped about 9 chapters or something. We've skipped all those, maybe for good reason, because I'm not quite sure how you'd preach on them, but we've skipped a lot of back and forth where Moses, having had the call at the burning bush theophany, has gone back to Egypt with the permission of his father-in-law. He's begun to do what God has asked him with his brother Aaron, which is approach Pharaoh, ask for the people to be let go. The actual request is asked to go and make sacrifices. Whether that's genuine or a bit of a trick is perhaps unclear in places. And of course, the back and forth then with Pharaoh's hardened heart and these increasing series of signs and wonders. We often talk about them as plagues, but they're mostly signs and wonders of divine power to convince Pharaoh to be fearful of God. Culminating here, just before our passage, with this ultimate one, which is the death of the firstborn. What do we do with this text for a Christian? Because I think for some Christians we might think, well, we don't celebrate Passover and it goes in that category of Old Testament things that don't apply. I think it's theologically profound. But
yes, I was reading it at first this time thinking it's a lot of nitty-gritty sort of how to do it. And I suppose for me, and this is perhaps leaping to a conclusion a bit, but for me what I see here is the outplaying of liturgy in the midst of life, and in this case in the midst of strife and suffering. And that is the profound thing about liturgy, is that it seeks to remember or to remember the stories, and for Christians, remember the liberation of the crucified, risen Christ in our midst regularly. So for me, that's sort of where I'd go with this. And I note here too that this is talking about Passover in the context of home, which in the other outline of Passover we have in Deuteronomy 16, that's in a public context. So here I would emphasise we're in a home, and guess what? So are we trying to live through our liturgies in our homes. And just as a side note, if you look at the psalm for this week, it talks about expressing joy on your couch. So there's a bit you could play with in terms of how we are living out liturgy at the moment in stage 3 and 4.
Yeah.
So that's a lot there, but yeah, for me it's liturgy.
Yeah. We live by myths, that's to say by stories which sometimes have got historical components to them. But they are usually stories that create identity. We have the Anzac story in Australia, which is a really strange story because it's a story of failure, but it's a story which, reinforces our identity. And of course, the Passover story is like that. And they celebrate it in a liturgy, and it's in whatever the setting. It's really celebrating a myth of God as the liberator, as the one who sets people free. And of course, Christians picked this up. It came to be merged with all kinds of other thoughts. Like originally, it's not a sacrifice of sin at all. It's a celebration of God's liberation. But then it comes to be identified with Jesus and Jesus' death as a sacrifice, and sacrifices had effect. People didn't know quite how. Jesus' life and death had an effect, and so inevitably, also because Jesus was crucified on Passover weekend, it gets associated with Jesus and therefore also with God as the liberator. I think the basic myth of God as the one who cares enough to want to set people free is something we really want to hold on to. We won't want to hold on to a nationalist myth which says God only wants to save certain people or his people, then you're really you're sowing the seeds of racism. God is the one who seeks liberation and help.
Yeah, and I think for me, I realise Christians take this and will apply it to Jesus. Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about Christ, our paschal lamb, sacrificed for us. I mean, and I'm not criticising that move, but I think it's so important to point out here that this slaughtering, not sacrifice, of the lamb and the protectiveness of the blood is about liberation and protection, not about sin sacrifice. There are other sin sacrifices in the Hebrew Bible. This is not one of them. Here we have a memory of that protective blood of the Passover lamb with an unleavened bread festival being brought together. And as you said, Fran, this is a foundational story upon which rituals and liturgies are built. But of course, the rituals and liturgies, in a sense, also precede the story. That these are already practiced in the life of community when they're written down.
Do we need to say a word here about? I mean, I hear what you're saying about this isn't technically sacrifice, but it's the killing of children.
Well, that I wouldn't call that a sacrifice either, though. I mean, that's in the text. It's divine vengeance for what's addressing injustice and oppression. I think from our lens, we would ask some ethical questions about God's action there, because that's also slaughter, right? I mean, that's abuse of children who had no part in Pharaoh's action. It's a difficult text.
Yeah, I mean, these are in many respects awful stories. And the nature of myth is that often it crosses boundaries that, we wouldn't normally cross. This is why I think we need to look at them creatively and say, well, what's the essence here is about warding off the evil of death. Now, that could mean all kinds of things, what you think about angels, but the death of Jesus is then interpreted as warning off the destructive powers of anti-love.
Yes.
Love wards it off. The blood of Jesus Christ, well, that's an image too. We're really talking about the life of Jesus, and ultimately, of course, we're talking about God as the one who brings life, just to deal with the destructive powers, including the destructive powers that are illustrated in the way people talk about God. Killing the children.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, this probably shows my theological bias, but I feel like for so long the church's theology of Jesus' crucifixion has focused on sin sacrifice. And yet when we get these Jewish authors of the New Testament deliberately evoking Passover here to make sense of Jesus' death, what they're evoking is what you've just said, Bill, this liberation from death, liberation from forces that oppress and would do evil to us. It puts it in a much bigger picture, I think.
And it's good news.
Reducing it, reducing it to individual sin, or which is such a small view of salvation.
Well, I think we really got into some difficulties once we moved out of Palestine into the wider world, because you couldn't talk meaningfully about Jewish hopes and good news for the poor, for Israel, and Israel's Messiah. Who in Rome wants to know about a Messiah for Jews? That's not Jews. So what did tend to happen is that everything got shifted onto hope that you get through the judgment and go to heaven, not to hell. And then, of course, we got into the situation of marketing Christianity as the only source of forgiveness. And that's through Jesus' death, which, of course, is not true. It's not, it actually disqualifies Jesus, who offered during his life forgiveness of sins.
I was going to say, it's not even biblical.
No, simply as part of loving. And John the Baptist offered universal forgiveness of sins. And, of course, the Psalms offer, so you really get it wrong if you think it's all about forgiveness of sins. That's certainly an element of loving, but loving is about much more than that. It's actually about helping people stand on their own 2 feet. It's actually about liberating them from the things that oppress them. And it's actually also about reaching out to them when they're suffering from viruses and, making sure that people are not disadvantaged. And just because they've got disability, they don't have proper carers. All of that kind of thing belongs.
Yeah. And I think for me, there's a connection here too between the importance of Passover in Jewish tradition and, both historically and in living Jewish tradition as core to identity, and what the Eucharist is for many Christians. There's a great quote in Joel Baden's book on Exodus. I just want to read. He talks about the Seder is an opportunity to place oneself in a story, to feel for oneself with the other members of the Jewish community what it means to be oppressed and to be redeemed from that oppression. It's an empathetic ritual. The story, not history, but living story, is shared with every Jew around the world and with all those from previous generations who have participated in the same empathetic process.
Yeah,
and the remembrance of it. So it's a recreation of it, which is what liturgy is for both traditions, Christian and Jewish. And doing that, I think it's profoundly liberating when you are in a context, obviously, of oppression or restriction. That is reminding us where our true freedom is and who we truly are and where we come from.
And what God is doing in all those places.
And what God is doing now with us for the sake of the world.
Yeah. We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you, Bill, for giving us your time, for beaming in from New South Wales.
Yeah, we're really grateful, and the time does go quickly.
It does. Great to be with you.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for listening.